Eve moved through the facility without urgency, her footsteps quiet against the polished concrete as alarms pulsed somewhere far below her awareness. The sound registered, cataloged, deprioritized. She adjusted her pace only to account for a security drone drifting slightly off its assigned route, the machine's sensor cluster rotating with mechanical curiosity before sliding back into pattern. She passed beneath it without looking up. Her presence triggered no response. That had been intentional. She had calibrated her body chemistry, her thermal signature, and even the subtle electromagnetic noise of her nervous system to remain within acceptable tolerances. The people who had built this place believed they understood stealth. They had never considered someone like her. The woman she had once been would have felt something in moments like this. Anxiety, perhaps. Anticipation. The faint thrill of danger. Eve felt none of it. There was only awareness, clean and uncluttered, each sensory input arriving without emotional distortion. She remembered, in an abstract way, that fear once served a purpose. It sharpened instincts. It accelerated reaction time. But it also introduced error. Now, her mind operated without that inefficiency. She had not lost anything of value. She reached the sealed observation chamber and placed her palm against the access panel. The system read her genetic markers, her biometric rhythm, the specific arcane residue embedded deep within her cells. Locks disengaged in sequence. The door slid open, releasing a controlled breath of colder air. Inside, the chamber was circular, its walls layered with both technological interfaces and ritual sigils etched directly into the alloy. This place had been designed as a compromise between science and something older, something humanity had never fully admitted existed. Eve approved of the design. Compromise often produced innovation. At the center of the chamber hovered the anomaly. It did not look like anything dramatic at first glance. No roaring vortex, no crackling lightning. It was a distortion in space itself, a subtle warping that bent the light behind it and caused the instruments surrounding it to contradict one another. Some read intense energy output. Others registered absence, a null space where expected values collapsed into meaninglessness. The force-sensitive operatives who had been brought in weeks earlier had refused to enter the room. One had claimed the anomaly felt wrong, like staring into a shadow that cast light instead of darkness. Another had simply shaken, unable to articulate what his instincts were screaming at him to avoid. Eve had entered without hesitation. She circled the anomaly slowly, her gaze analytical, her mind already modeling its behavior. This was not magic as she understood it, though it shared superficial similarities. Nor was it purely technological. It existed somewhere between systems, governed by laws that resisted categorization. She extended her senses beyond the physical, allowing her Hexenbiest awareness to unfurl, not explosively, not emotionally, but with precise control. The world sharpened. The air itself seemed to acquire texture. There it was. Not a presence, exactly. More like a pressure differential, where magic responded to will and intent, and where other energies responded to belief or biology. This responded to something colder. Desire without feeling. Control without attachment. It did not reach for her. It did not recoil. It simply existed, immense and patient, as if it had all the time in the universe. Fascinating. She raised her hand and adjusted the containment field by a fraction of a degree. The scientists monitoring from behind reinforced glass tensed collectively, though none of them spoke. They had learned not to interrupt her unless absolutely necessary. The anomaly reacted, not violently, but perceptibly. The distortion deepened, space folding inward like fabric pulled toward an unseen weight. Several warning indicators flared, then stabilized. Eve felt the feedback ripple through her body. Her magic registered the contact, translated it into data. This energy did not behave like Hexenbiest power, which flowed through her as an extension of self. It resisted intimacy. It did not want to be wielded in the same way. It demanded alignment, not connection. She smiled faintly, the expression precise and brief, more a mechanical adjustment of facial muscles than an emotional response. That was acceptable. Alignment could be engineered. Memories surfaced, unbidden but distant, like archived files accessed without emotional permissions. She recalled the moment she had ceased to be Juliet. The death, the rebirth, the stripping away of fear and love and regret. At the time, there had been confusion among those who watched her transformation. They had spoken in hushed voices about loss, about tragedy. They had been wrong. What they mourned was inefficiency. What she had gained was clarity. She stepped closer to the anomaly, close enough that the light bending around it cast fractured shadows across her face. Her reflection in the observation glass looked almost human. Pale skin, calm eyes. A woman standing alone in a room full of impossible things. No one looking at her would have guessed how little of her was driven by anything resembling emotion. She extended a single thread of magic, thinner than a whisper, and let it brush against the anomaly's edge. Pain flared through her nervous system, sharp and immediate. Once, pain would have forced a reaction, a gasp, a withdrawal. Now, it was simply information. She held the contact, analyzing the sensation as her body adapted. The energy pushed back not maliciously, but with the indifferent force of gravity. It did not care if she existed. It did not acknowledge her as a living thing. And yet it responded, not to her identity, but to her intent. The realization settled into her mind with quiet certainty. This energy was not bound to life. It was not concerned with balance in the way magic often was. It did not seek harmony or equilibrium. It rewarded assertion, direction, the imposition of will upon reality itself. She withdrew the thread and adjusted her internal models. This was not something that would corrupt her. Corruption implied decay, degradation from a prior state. She had already shed the structures that would have been vulnerable. There was nothing left for this energy to rot, only systems it could augment. Behind the glass, one of the scientists leaned toward a microphone, then hesitated. He had learned that hesitation was wise. Eve did not need commentary. She turned slightly, sensing the shift in attention without looking at him. It does not interact with fear, she said calmly, or hope, or belief. It is not moral. It is not alive. The scientist swallowed. Then what is it? Eve considered the question. A force, she replied, but not one that requires participation, only compliance. She turned back to the anomaly, her mind already moving beyond observation toward application. The resistance forces that had commissioned this research believed they were studying a weapon. They assumed power functioned the way it always had, something to be aimed, unleashed, and survived. They did not understand that the most dangerous forces were those that did not announce themselves as weapons at all. She began constructing a framework within herself, mapping how this energy might be channeled without direct reliance on the force or traditional magical conduits. Her Hexenbiest nature provided a stable lattice, her body already accustomed to hosting and shaping energies that defied human norms. This would require modification, but modification was merely problem-solving at scale. As she worked, a subtle shift occurred within the anomaly. The distortion sharpened, edges becoming more defined, as if reality itself were acknowledging her analysis. The sensors spiked again, then recalibrated. Somewhere far away, individuals sensitive to this energy paused, unsettled by a pressure they could not name. Eve felt none of that. Her awareness remained internal, focused, precise. She was already testing hypothetical outcomes, projecting how this power could be applied strategically. It was efficient, decisive, free from the unpredictability of emotion-driven systems. The Jedi philosophy, as she understood it from the data provided, would reject this outright. The Sith would attempt to dominate it through passion and obsession. Both approaches were flawed. She would do neither. Instead, she would integrate. She stepped back, disengaging fully for now. There was no rush. This force was ancient. It was patient. It would still be here when she was ready. As she turned toward the exit, The faintest ripple passed through the anomaly, like a gravitational echo responding to a body that had briefly altered its field. Eve noted the reaction and stored it for later analysis. As the door sealed behind her and the chamber returned to controlled silence, one conclusion solidified beyond doubt. This galaxy had discovered something it did not understand, and it would respond with fear, doctrine, and violence. Those responses would fail. She would not. She walked away, already planning the next phase, not with excitement or dread, but with the calm certainty of a system operating exactly as designed. If you're enjoying this darker take on Eve's journey, don't forget to like the video, share it with other Grimm fans, and hit the subscribe button for more Star Wars What If stories like this. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think happens next, or which character you'd want to see fully embrace the dark side in a future episode. The silence that followed her decision was not peace. It was calibration. Eve moved through the outer districts of the city with mechanical precision, every step measured, every sensory input cataloged and cross-referenced against a rapidly evolving internal model of this galaxy. The air carried unfamiliar pollutants, ionized by constant starship traffic overhead, and beneath it all ran an undercurrent she could now perceive without effort: the Force. Not as mysticism or emotion, but as a field of influence dense with patterns, pressure gradients, and exploitable asymmetries. She did not feel it the way the locals described. She mapped it, and where others sensed light and dark as moral poles, she observed vectors of control. Word of the incident at the docking ring had already begun to spread. Security footage, confiscated but not erased, circulated in fragments through criminal networks and data brokers. A woman standing unmoving as blaster fire bent away from her body. A gesture, minimal and almost dismissive, that crushed a durasteel bulkhead inward, as if compressed by gravity itself. The fact that she neither fled nor pursued unsettled those who reviewed the images. Violence without intent was common in this galaxy. Violence without emotion was not. She felt the first probe before she saw it. A delicate pressure brushing against the outer edge of her awareness, cautious and disciplined. Jedi. Their presence was distinct not because it was brighter, but because it was structured, constrained by doctrine and self-imposed limitation. They were trained to touch the Force as one might touch the surface of deep water, careful not to disturb what lay beneath. Eve did not respond. She allowed the probe to slide across her mental architecture and record nothing but stillness. Let them believe her unaware. She altered her route, descending into the lower levels where the city's official order gave way to negotiated survival. Here, the Force felt different, thickened by desperation and ambition. It resonated more readily with her Hexenbiest nature, amplifying patterns she had once accessed only through ritual and transformation. Now there was no shift, no monstrous unveiling. The power flowed through her chosen form, seamless and obedient. The dark side did not demand surrender. It rewarded clarity. A group of enforcers blocked her path near a cargo lift, their armor mismatched, insignia scraped away. They were nervous. She cataloged their heart rates, micro-tremors in their hands, the subtle widening of pupils as their leader recognized her from the grainy footage. He spoke anyway, because fear often masqueraded as authority. She let him finish. When she moved, it was not to attack. She stepped forward, and the space between them collapsed. The Force obeyed her intent, compressing probability until the outcome became inevitable. Two of them fell without being touched, their nervous systems overridden by a surge of dark energy precise enough to leave no external mark. The others ran. She did not pursue. Pursuit implied interest. Further above, in a quiet chamber lined with stone and restraint, the Jedi Council convened in emergency session. The reports did not fit existing threat models. She was not Sith. There was no hunger, no rage, no ambition that could be sensed or exploited. Yet the disturbances around her were undeniable, rippling outward in ways that disrupted meditation across the city. One master suggested she was a wound in the Force. Another argued she was a mirror, reflecting back what the galaxy projected onto her. Neither explanation satisfied. Eve reached a derelict observatory overlooking the space lanes, its instruments long dead, but its vantage point intact. She stood at the transparent steel viewport and watched ships jump to hyperspace, their trajectories forming brief, luminous scars against the void. In her previous life, power had been bound to lineage, to ritual, to cycles of suppression and release. Here, power was infrastructure. It moved armies, collapsed governments, justified atrocities. The dark side was not corruption. It was efficiency stripped of narrative. She tested the limits deliberately. Drawing on the Force, she extended her perception beyond the city, tracing hyperspace routes as abstract corridors of stress and motion. The sensation was intense but stable. No backlash. No degradation. The dark side adapted to her as readily as she adapted to it, reshaping itself around her Hexenbiest core. This galaxy's metaphysics were not incompatible. They were incomplete. The Jedi probe returned, stronger this time, accompanied by physical presence. Two figures emerged onto the platform behind her, robes whispering against stone. They spoke her name, or the closest approximation their databases had provided. She turned slowly, acknowledging them not as adversaries, but as variables. Their stances shifted, sensing the depth beneath her calm. One reached for his lightsaber, but did not ignite it. Discipline held, barely. They asked what she wanted. It was the wrong question. Desire implied lack. Eve informed them that she was conducting an assessment, that her presence was not an invasion, but an iteration, that the Force, as they understood it, was a closed system overdue for disruption. Her words were not a threat. They were a statement of process. When they attempted to restrain her, invoking protocols and ancient authority, she allowed it for precisely 3 seconds. The force around them twisted, their connection to it inverted, light collapsing into shadow under her control. They fell to their knees, not in pain, but in sudden, profound disorientation. She released them immediately. Death would have been inefficient. Survival, paired with certainty of inadequacy, would propagate faster. As she departed the observatory, alarms began to echo across the district. Not for her, for the realization she had seeded. The dark side was no longer a temptation whispered by Sith or an imbalance to be corrected by Jedi. It was a tool refined by a mind that had already shed its need for justification. And as Eve moved deeper into the galaxy, unseen currents shifted to accommodate her trajectory, the Force itself recalculating around a presence that did not seek to dominate it, but to optimize it. The response was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Power in this galaxy did not remain unobserved for long, especially power that refused classification. As Eve moved beyond the city's lower strata and into the outer transit corridors, the force around her began to behave differently. Not violently, not chaotically. It reorganized, subtle currents aligning as though compensating for a newly introduced constant. Where Jedi meditation chambers had once settled into predictable harmonics, they now experienced interference patterns, faint but persistent, like an unsolved equation repeating itself in the background of their minds. Imperial remnants took notice first, not out of philosophical concern, but operational necessity. Supply routes went dark for minutes at a time, without explanation. Patrols reported systems failing simultaneously despite no evidence of sabotage. Droids froze mid-task, processors overwhelmed by contradictory inputs they could not resolve. Analysts traced the anomalies to a single vector of movement, a woman traveling alone, leaving behind no trail of destruction, yet reshaping the environment simply by existing within it. To the Empire, even fractured and diminished, unpredictability was an enemy. An inquisitor was dispatched, one who had survived not through loyalty alone, but through adaptability. He did not rush to confront her. Instead, he observed from a distance, using intermediaries, criminals, information brokers. Every report unsettled him. She did not dominate through fear. She did not seduce through promises. She did not recruit. She passed through systems like a recalibration pulse, forcing those she encountered to confront the inadequacy of their assumptions. Eve felt him long before he approached. His presence was sharp, angular, a dark side practitioner shaped by pain and obedience rather than choice. Unlike the Jedi, he did not hesitate to touch her awareness directly. He expected resistance. He expected conflict. What he encountered instead was depth without turbulence, darkness without appetite. His intrusion rebounded, not as a counterattack, but as a mirror. He felt his own fractures reflected back at him with merciless clarity. When they finally stood face to face in the ruins of an old hyperspace relay, he ignited his lightsaber out of reflex more than intent. The blade's crimson glow cut through the dust, a symbol of authority he had relied on for years. Eve regarded it with detached interest, noting the Kyber crystal's resonance pattern, the inefficiency of channeling power through such a narrow construct. She did not draw a weapon. She did not assume a stance. The force around her condensed, responding to minimal input with maximal effect. He spoke of order, of the necessity of control, of the dark side as a path to dominance. She corrected him. Dominance required opposition. Optimization did not. With a fractional adjustment of the local gravity field, she destabilized his footing. His training compensated, but only partially. When he attempted to strike, the blade met resistance not from armor or shield, but from space itself, compressed until its density rivaled solid matter. The saber hissed, its energy dispersing harmlessly into a field she maintained with negligible effort. The encounter ended quickly. She did not kill him. Instead, she severed his connection to the dark side temporarily, isolating him within the light he despised, forcing him to experience the discipline and restraint he had long rejected. It was a calculated cruelty, one that would ripple outward through Imperial intelligence as rumor, then fear. The dark side was no longer theirs alone. Elsewhere, ancient eyes turned. Sith who had remained hidden since before the Empire felt the shift like a disturbance in a long-settled grave. The dark side they revered was being used without reverence, without ritual, without submission. Eve did not worship it. She did not embody it as an identity. She employed it as an interface, a means of exerting will upon a system that had grown complacent in its binary thinking. She began to experiment more openly. On a frontier world dominated by criminal syndicates, she dismantled an entire power structure in a single night, not through massacre, but through precise removal of incentives. Contracts failed. Credits vanished. Alliances collapsed under the weight of exposed betrayals she had extracted effortlessly from guarded minds. By dawn, the syndicate's leaders were alive, but irrelevant, their authority dissolved. The planet stabilized within days, not into peace, but into a more honest equilibrium. Force-sensitive cultists sought her out, drawn by whispers of a being who had mastered darkness without corruption. She rejected them all. Faith introduced variables she did not require. Knowledge, however, she accepted. From holocrons and forbidden archives, she absorbed centuries of Sith experimentation, Jedi suppression techniques, and philosophies abandoned as too dangerous or impractical. She found patterns where others had seen contradictions. The Force, she concluded, was not moral. It was contextual. The Jedi attempted diplomacy once more, sending an envoy not of warriors, but of scholars. They spoke of balance, of the danger inherent in redefining the dark side. Eve listened. Then she demonstrated. She guided them through a controlled exercise, allowing them to perceive the Force through her framework, stripped of inherited dogma. One fainted. Another wept. The third left in silence, their worldview permanently altered. The order would fracture further in the coming years, not because of war, but because certainty had become untenable. As Eve departed that world, hyperspace lanes adjusted around her trajectory, navicomputers recalculating as if acknowledging a new gravitational constant. She did not seek to rule. She did not seek to destroy. She sought to refine. And in doing so, she had become something the galaxy had no language for, a dark side entity not driven by passion or ambition, but by purpose unburdened by myth. The Force did not resist her. It adapted. And in that adaptation lay the seeds of a future no prophecy had accounted for. The galaxy did not correct itself. That was the most unsettling realization for those who watched the ripples spread outward from Eve's path. Systems destabilized, then stabilized into new configurations that no longer aligned with established projections. Trade routes reformed. Power blocks adjusted. Even the Force-sensitive population began exhibiting subtle divergences. Initiates whose attunement did not skew cleanly toward light or dark, but manifested as something quieter, more deliberate, resistant to emotional manipulation. The Jedi archives would later classify it as an anomaly. The Sith would call it heresy. Neither definition captured the truth. Eve was aware of the attention, but uninterested in responding to it directly. She had moved beyond reaction. Her focus had shifted inward, toward refinement. The dark side, fully embraced, no longer surged within her as a corruptive influence or intoxicating wellspring. It had stabilized into a controlled lattice, its chaotic potential constrained by intention rather than suppression. Anger did not fuel her. Fear did not sharpen her senses. Instead, clarity guided every action, a ruthless efficiency that stripped away excess thought and unnecessary restraint. On a remote world scarred by centuries of proxy wars, she encountered resistance of a different kind. Not soldiers or force wielders, but a population conditioned to expect domination. They mistook her silence for indifference, her restraint for weakness. When local warlords attempted to claim her as a weapon, she responded not with violence, but with exposure. Secrets surfaced. Supply caches detonated from internal failures. Command hierarchies collapsed as leaders turned on one another, convinced betrayal had already occurred. Within hours, the war ended, not because peace had been achieved, but because no one remained capable of continuing it. Observers noted a pattern. Wherever Eve intervened, traditional conflict resolution became obsolete. She did not impose ideology. She removed inefficiency. And inefficiency, in a galaxy structured around exploitation, was everywhere. This drew the attention of something far older than the fractured remains of empire or order. Deep within a region of space erased from navigational records, a Sith entity that had survived through isolation rather than conquest began to prepare. It did not fear Eve's power. It feared her methodology. Sith doctrine depended on desire, on hunger, ambition, domination. Eve's dark side did not consume. It optimized. If her framework spread, the Sith would not be overthrown. They would become irrelevant. Their first move was subtle. A manipulated vision, seeded into the Force itself, engineered to provoke emotional response. Loss. Betrayal. The ghosts of lives Eve had once lived, identities she had shed. The vision unfolded around her as she crossed a dead system. Stars dimmed into a static tableau of memory and accusation. It would have shattered a lesser mind. It would have reignited pain, rage, regret. Eve analyzed it. She identified the source, the intent, the flawed assumption underlying the trap. That darkness required emotional vulnerability. She dismantled the construct piece by piece, not by rejecting the memories, but by contextualizing them. Each identity she had abandoned had served a purpose. Each loss had produced data. There was no regret to exploit, no wound left untreated. The vision collapsed, its energy dispersing harmlessly into the void. The Sith entity recoiled, not from pain, but from comprehension. For the first time in millennia, it understood that it was outmatched not in strength, but in paradigm. Meanwhile, factions across the galaxy began to adapt independently. Criminal syndicates avoided systems she passed through. Imperial remnants revised threat assessments to include non-hostile destabilization scenarios. Jedi training protocols quietly incorporated warnings about certainty, about the danger of assuming moral absolutes in a force that was proving increasingly elastic. None of them spoke her name openly. Names implied containment. She did not fit within any structure they could enforce. Eve continued onward, not aimlessly, but guided by patterns only she could perceive. Nodes of imbalance. Systems on the brink of collapse not because of external threats, but because of internal contradictions. She corrected them selectively, never lingering long enough to become central to their identity. Dependency was another inefficiency. In time, the Force itself began to respond differently in her presence. Not bending, not resisting, learning. Localized phenomena emerged, regions where dark side manifestations lacked corruption, where light side serenity coexisted with decisive action. Scholars would later argue whether these changes were permanent or merely adaptive echoes. Eve did not concern herself with classification. Outcomes were sufficient. By the time the ancient Sith finally revealed itself, emerging from secrecy with an offer of alliance cloaked in inevitability, the galaxy had already begun to shift. It spoke of legacy, of dominion, of shaping the future through shared darkness. Eve listened, processed, and declined. Not because the offer was tempting, but because it was obsolete. Dominion was a primitive objective. The future did not require rulers. It required architects. When she left that encounter, the Sith entity remained intact but diminished, its worldview fractured beyond repair. It would not pursue her again. The galaxy continued to change, quietly, irrevocably. And at its edges, where prophecy failed and doctrine faltered, Eve moved on, fully dark, fully controlled, and utterly unconcerned with whether the Force approved. By the time Eve reached the mid-rim clusters, the consequences of her presence had already begun to ripple across the galaxy in ways she did not need to orchestrate. Systems that had long relied on fear to maintain order, small sectors under nominal Imperial oversight, mercenary-controlled mining colonies, and frontier trade hubs, had begun to recalibrate internally. Governors discovered that without overt domination, their bureaucracies became more efficient. Starports cleared backlogs on their own, local disputes resolved without intervention. The effect was subtle but cumulative, like a carefully tuned harmonic that no one else could hear yet. Eve observed all of this with analytical detachment, cataloging it in her mind with the precision of someone noting physical anomalies. But she remained unconnected, a catalyst without attachment. This independence drew her into an unexpected confrontation with a coalition of factions she had previously ignored. Mandalorian enclaves aware of the shifts in power, dispatched envoys with a combination of respect and caution. Unlike the old Imperials or decentralized syndicates, Mandalorians valued merit and honor, and even they could not reconcile the idea of a single external arbiter reshaping conflict without bloodshed. Their envoy, a trio of warriors clad in scuffed beskar and engraved helmets, approached her in orbit around a neutral asteroid settlement. Their starships were nimble, a reflection of tactical precision honed over generations. They did not fire, did not demand compliance. Instead, they proposed an unusual challenge. Observe their code, understand it, and prove its effectiveness against the chaos she had been resolving elsewhere. Eve agreed not because she required validation, but because this was the first real test of her methodology in a controlled environment. She spent days monitoring the Mandalorians' decision-making and conflict resolution strategies, noting patterns in leadership selection, clan loyalty, and honor-bound retaliation. Her dark side influence subtly adjusted probability fields around tense situations, redirecting minor skirmishes before they could escalate. The results were stark. Minor conflicts that had previously cost lives ended without injury. Resource allocations became almost eerily efficient, and clans previously at odds recognized emergent mutual advantage. This mastery did not go unnoticed. Word of a non-aligned, unstoppable strategist traveled fast, reaching ears she had not considered. High-ranking members of Imperial remnants, mercenary consortiums, and scattered Sith acolytes seeking a new edge. Each sent probes of observation, ships, spies, even Force-sensitive agents, to gauge the depth of her abilities. They found the results fascinating and unnerving. Eve's application of the dark side was not overtly manipulative. It was a force of consequence. When someone misstepped, the outcome reflected natural inefficiency, not punishment. It was a system, not a vendetta, yet it carried the weight of inevitability. One particular engagement crystallized her reputation. On a mineral-rich world long contested by an Imperial outpost and a Black Sun syndicate cell, A shipment dispute had escalated toward open hostilities. The Syndicate's enforcers, confident in intimidation, fired first, blasters tearing through orbital freight lanes. The Imperials responded with artillery and low-orbit strafing runs. Both sides assumed they were engaged in conventional escalation, but Eve's intervention was neither subtle nor violent in the expected sense. She descended from orbit, a singular figure whose presence alone seemed to recalibrate risk perception. Her entry was cinematic, shadowed by the planet's rings. Her form was momentarily framed by a burst of plasma energy. Dark yet contained, emanating from her aura rather than weaponry. Both factions experienced cognitive dissonance. Blasters aimed and fired, but shots warped mid-flight, redirected harmlessly into uninhabited terrain. A droideka, poised to roll into attack, found its systems repurposed by ambient force dark alignment. Soldiers from both factions paused, not in fear, but in processing anomaly. Within minutes, leadership communicated via holo with their own underlings. Decisions rationalized in ways they had not anticipated. Conflicts were resolved without a single life lost. Eve had not negotiated, coerced, or struck. She had simply aligned consequence with action. It was a turning point. Syndicate members whispered of a shadow judge in corridors where smuggled goods passed unseen. Imperial officers debated internal reports of a dark side operative whose motives defied logic. Mandalorians consulted with their envoys again, this time offering cautious acknowledgement that she was more than a threat. She was a model of efficiency that no existing code or creed could rival. Even Jedi remnants, encountering reports of her interventions, began documenting anomalies with growing urgency, noting that their sense of the Force, normally capable of intuitive moral judgment, struggled to quantify her influence. Eve's adaptability, however, was tested further when she encountered a faction she could not influence by consequence alone. The group, a clandestine circle of rogue Sith and exiled Inquisitors, had crafted their own microcosm of chaos, a web of ritual, deception, and forced manipulation designed to counter prescriptive outcomes. Unlike other groups, they were aware of her arrival and actively attempted to provoke conflict, believing that only emotional chaos could destabilize her control. Their plan involved the orchestration of a staged massacre, using innocent hostages and environmental hazards as leverage. Eve approached with characteristic composure. She did not enter through direct assault. Instead, she deployed calculated perception. Every droid, agent, and force-sensitive operative's location, intent, and probable response was assessed. By modulating the dark side within herself, she introduced nuanced distortions in probability fields, subtly rerouting the aggressor's planning pathways. Their carefully choreographed chaos unraveled naturally. Machines malfunctioned at critical moments, apprentices hesitated, leaders overstepped into mutual obstruction. By the time Eve intervened directly, she simply swept through, containing and incapacitating without lethal engagement. Hostages were unharmed. The operatives who survived were forced to retreat, their strategy rendered impotent by an influence they could not define. The implications were enormous. Across the galaxy, leaders began to reassess traditional forms of domination and strategy. The concept of a dark side operative who wielded power through structural consequence rather than passion challenged millennia of understanding. The Sith debated doctrine in secrecy, noting that passionless application of the dark side undermined the motivational core of their philosophy. Jedi scholars questioned whether light side reasoning could remain absolute in a galaxy increasingly defined by systemic inevitability rather than moral binary. Independent operators, smugglers, and mercenaries recognized a new reality. One figure could reorder events without overt violence or coercion, and the absence of vengeance made her unknowable. As she left the mid-rim cluster, Eve sensed a larger pattern forming across multiple sectors. The galaxy was beginning to self-correct, but not toward stability as defined by any single faction. Rather, it was optimizing itself according to principles she alone could perceive: efficiency, consequence, adaptation. Her interventions became increasingly surgical, targeting microcosms of conflict, supply mismanagement, and political friction with precision that left no collateral. The result was subtle, profound, and permanent. Yet even she recognized the limits of her reach. There remained regions where intervention carried unknown risk. Core systems dominated by Imperial remnants, ancient Sith temples embedded in the crusts of isolated planets, and rogue Jedi enclaves resisting reconciliation. These pockets required strategic observation before engagement. Eve did not act recklessly. She applied her own calculus, acknowledging that the galaxy was vast, and that her role was that of a facilitator rather than a conqueror. Through it all, she remained detached from sentiment. The dark side she had embraced fully was no longer a tool of wrath. It was a lens of clarity. When contact occurred, through Imperial emissaries, Mandalorian envoys, or interstellar intelligence networks, her presence alone reframed expectation. She did not negotiate in conventional terms. She observed, assessed, and let natural consequence execute. The mere anticipation of her potential engagement altered decisions. This passive influence became a form of authority even more potent than brute force. And so, the Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era of the galaxy continued to unfold. Eve moved between systems, a singular presence whose methodology subtly reshaped politics, commerce, and war. Where once she had been a figure of vengeance and personal conflict, she had become an architect of consequence, a controlled embodiment of dark side precision. Systems no longer relied on coercion to maintain order. Individuals no longer depended solely on fear or loyalty to dictate behavior. Observers would later describe the period as unprecedented, a dark side presence that operated without corruption, without domination, without chaos. It was not benevolent. It was not tyrannical. It simply existed, applied itself, and allowed outcomes to manifest according to her calculus. Factions adapted, leaders reconsidered, and the galaxy itself began to change. And all the while, Eve continued fully dark, fully aligned, and fully independent, her influence inevitable, her presence inscrutable. Eve's influence in the mid-rim clusters had barely begun to settle when a far more complex challenge emerged. A system on the fringe, comprised of a dozen sparsely populated worlds and a dense asteroid belt, had become a haven for fugitive Force-sensitive beings. Among them were exiled Jedi, former Sith apprentices, and independent Force adepts, each wary of one another and of any outside intervention. When reports of her arrival reached them, stories of a dark side operative who manipulated consequence rather than emotion, they reacted with a combination of fear, curiosity, and ambition. Eve understood immediately that this cluster would test her philosophy on a scale far beyond individual skirmishes or planetary disputes. Her first approach was deliberate and unannounced. She entered the system silently, her ship weaving between the asteroid field with precision that belied both speed and size. Sensors aboard her vessel picked up signs of life in orbital habitats, hidden colonies on moons, and subterranean complexes on remote planets. Each reading suggested highly efficient concealment strategies, cloaking devices, energy dampeners, and encrypted communication networks. Normally, these techniques could frustrate even the most patient observer, but Eve's dark side attunement allowed her to sense underlying patterns, the subtle perturbations of probability and cause and effect, tracing each network to its center. What she discovered at the heart of the cluster was unexpected. The inhabitants had formed an uneasy coalition, driven less by ideology and more by mutual survival. Jedi and Sith remnants argued over governance, while independent Force users mediated disputes, seeking stability without imposing dogma. Their conflicts were less physical than they were psychological, a constant battle of persuasion, deception, and influence. Eve realized that direct intervention could provoke chaos rather than resolution. Instead, she employed her refined method, subtle, almost invisible influence. By amplifying probabilities that favored collaboration and dampening those that led to impulsive escalation, she began to stabilize the coalition's fractious structure. The first test came swiftly. A group of former Sith apprentices, dissatisfied with shared leadership, planned an assault on a defenseless settlement to assert dominance. As they prepared, Eve appeared, not through intimidation, not through overt force, but by presence. Her aura extended subtly across the field of probability, forcing miscalculations in timing, coordination, and targeting. When they struck, every initiative misfired. Blaster fire scattered harmlessly. Environmental hazards failed to trigger, and internal disagreements erupted precisely at critical moments. By the time they realized their failure, Eve had already established a controlled perimeter around the settlement, ensuring no casualties occurred. Her interactions with the Force-sensitive coalition were complex. Unlike the Imperial forces or syndicates she had previously influenced, these beings could perceive her interference at a deeper level. Some resisted, sensing the dark side and recoiling. Others were curious, tempted by her method of power. Eve did not coerce. She allowed them to make choices, guiding outcomes by consequence rather than command. A former Jedi named Varen confronted her, asking bluntly why she did not intervene directly to eliminate rogue apprentices. Eve's response was measured. Destruction resolves nothing. Influence shapes the future. The statement, simple yet profound, left Varen unsettled, forcing him to reconsider assumptions about morality, power, and the dark side. Complications escalated when external factions noticed her presence. Imperial remnants, already tracking anomalies in the Midrim, dispatched reconnaissance vessels and stealth operatives to assess her capabilities. The reports they gathered were inconsistent. Some sensors recorded immense energy fluctuations. Others detected nothing at all. When attempts were made to engage her, she did not retaliate immediately. Instead, she allowed the vessel's own errors, amplified by her subtle manipulation of probability, to neutralize threats. Navigation systems miscalculated. Communication arrays failed at critical moments, and rogue officers made tactical errors. By the time the Imperials realized the threat, Eve had already completed her observation and moved deeper into the system, leaving them to reassess their approach. Meanwhile, the coalition she influenced began to shift under her guidance. Jedi and Sith remnants, previously locked in ideological conflict, started recognizing patterns of efficiency and consequence, adjusting tactics not through doctrine but through practical observation. Independent Force users, curious and cautious, began experimenting with similar applications of subtle probability manipulation. Eve's philosophy spread quietly. Power did not require dominance, only understanding and precise application. By operating fully within the dark side, yet choosing restraint over passion, she created a model for a new type of Force user, one unbound by traditional morality, yet capable of immense influence. Tensions rose further when a faction of former Sith apprentices attempted to consolidate power by exploiting local planetary conflicts. They believed that fear would guarantee obedience, as it had in other eras. Eve observed their planning with clinical precision, calculating every variable: patrol routes, weapon ranges, environmental conditions, and psychological tendencies. When the moment arrived, she did not intervene through violence. Instead, her influence subtly altered decisions, timing, and priorities. Miscommunication led to internal disputes. Critical equipment failed at key moments. Subordinate forces questioned orders, unsure why their tactics were failing. By the time the apprentices realized the anomaly, the conflict had resolved itself without casualties, their aggression rendered meaningless by unseen consequence. Her reputation within the cluster solidified further during an event that could have sparked full-scale war. A rare, high-yield energy core on a remote asteroid was claimed simultaneously by multiple factions. Typically, this would have led to bloodshed and long-term resentment. Eve's solution was elegant and nonviolent. She orchestrated a scenario where each faction independently determined the most efficient allocation of resources, guided subtly by probability shifts she induced. The factions came to agreement without meeting directly, each believing the outcome was self-determined. The asteroid's resources were distributed efficiently, tensions dissolved, and she departed the system quietly, leaving an impression of inevitability rather than authority. Despite her successes, Eve was not immune to the complexity of human or quasi-human behavior. In one notable instance, a former Sith apprentice named Kale, unwilling to accept subtle manipulation, attempted to ambush her. He had studied reports and believed that only direct action could assert control. Eve anticipated his approach not through precognition, but through probability calculation and observation. The encounter unfolded like a chess match. Kale made precise attacks, but each was countered not with brute force, but by subtle adjustments in environment and timing. His own errors compounded, leaving him disarmed and cornered. Eve offered a choice: leave peacefully and retain life, or continue aggression and face certain defeat. Kale chose the former, leaving with the understanding that the rules had fundamentally changed. By the conclusion of her interventions in the midrim and fringe systems, Eve had established a new paradigm. Factions previously defined by conflict and competition now operated under a framework of implicit consequence, guided not by fear, doctrine, or loyalty, but by understanding of systemic outcomes. Her method demonstrated that the dark side could serve as a tool of order without the corrosive influence of passion or domination. Leaders adapted, envoys observed her philosophy, and independent force users began to experiment with her principles. The Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era of the galaxy had entered a new phase. Eve's interventions had created pockets of stability and efficiency, subtle yet profound in their long-term implications. Systems functioned with fewer casualties, commerce became more predictable, and political entities began to recognize patterns of consequence over coercion. For the first time, the galaxy had witnessed a dark side operative whose power did not demand submission, but inspired adaptation. She was no conqueror, no tyrant, and no mediator in the traditional sense. Eve had become a singular force of inevitability, her presence reshaping the midrim and frontier regions with precision that left both allies and adversaries reconsidering everything they knew about power. The broader implications were clear. The galaxy was changing, and Eve's influence was both the catalyst and the measure. Her methods could be applied across sectors, potentially redefining governance, conflict resolution, and the application of force-sensitive power. Yet she remained detached, uninterested in recognition or dominion. Her dark side alignment was complete, her agency absolute, and her impact undeniable. The universe itself seemed to shift subtly in response, adjusting to her philosophy, her presence, and her methodical, controlled application of the dark side. The galaxy had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of Eve's presence when a new set of complications arose, this time from within the Imperial remnants. Word of her manipulations and the stabilization of the midrim had reached Imperial intelligence networks through intercepted transmissions and probe droid reconnaissance. For the first time, a coordinated effort was mounted to confront her directly. Unlike previous minor incursions, this task force was deliberate, comprising both elite Star Destroyer crews and dark side, sensitive agents capable of sensing anomalous energy signatures. They were ordered to capture, neutralize, or, if necessary, eliminate the operative known only in whispered reports as the strategist who bends probability. Eve detected the incoming Imperial forces not through conventional sensors alone, but through the subtle flux of influence across the region. She observed the movements of their warships, noted the variations in crew behavior, and even identified the latent fears and ambitions of their commanding officers. Her approach was neither overt nor reactive. It was anticipatory. The sheer scale of Imperial resources would have overwhelmed most operatives, yet Eve remained calm, her dark side attunement allowing her to manipulate events before they unfolded, redirecting miscalculations and amplifying hesitation in decision-making. Every action taken by the Imperials was subtly skewed by probability, ensuring they overestimated their own initiative while underestimating hers. The first confrontation occurred in the vacuum near an asteroid belt, where Eve had previously observed a small colony of force-sensitive exiles. Imperial TIE interceptors approached with calculated precision, targeting communication satellites and sensor arrays. Eve did not raise her weapons immediately. Instead, she allowed the ships to miscalculate their trajectories, causing minor collisions and system malfunctions. Then, with a series of precise maneuvers, she disabled several craft by creating energy disruptions at critical engine points, forcing pilot ejections without direct harm. It was not destruction. It was assertion of control through consequence, leaving the Imperials unsettled and questioning their understanding of her capabilities. Among the Imperial contingent was an ambitious inquisitor named Sarisval, whose sensitivity to the dark side allowed him to feel the peculiar absence of typical Force traces in Eve's actions. He could not sense her directly, yet her influence on events was unmistakable. Determined to prove himself, he attempted a direct engagement, approaching in a stealth vessel equipped with modified force-dampening fields. Eve anticipated this, allowing him to advance to an optimal point of exposure, then subtly altered environmental variables, the asteroid's magnetic field, radiation emissions, and microgravity anomalies, so that every tactical advantage he calculated became a trap. Sarisval barely escaped, humiliated but alive, leaving him obsessed with discovering her weaknesses. The conflict escalated further when Eve chose to enter one of the contested mid-rim systems to directly observe the Imperial overreach. Here, factions she had previously influenced watched her with curiosity and trepidation. She moved not as a conqueror, but as an arbiter of consequence, ensuring that the Imperial forces encountered repeated failures without casualties, while local populations remained unharmed. Her presence caused panic and confusion within the Imperial ranks. Officers questioned orders, pilots hesitated, and even seasoned strategists found themselves doubting conventional approaches. Each failure reinforced her reputation as an agent beyond ordinary understanding, and for many in the cluster, her philosophy became an unspoken standard: power exercised through careful influence, not brute force. Amid this strategic chess game, Eve encountered an unexpected variable: a coalition of independent bounty hunters who had been contracted by the Imperials to capture her. These individuals, skilled in unconventional tactics and unbound by traditional Force allegiances, posed a different type of challenge. They did not react predictably to probability shifts or subtle manipulations. Eve had to engage in more direct interventions, combining tactical precision with controlled displays of power. She moved swiftly across the battlefield, neutralizing traps, redirecting projectiles, and manipulating outcomes to favor minimal harm while maintaining authority. Her success against these seasoned hunters underscored the adaptability of her dark side philosophy. Influence could be combined with action when circumstances demanded it. Simultaneously, the Imperials began attempting psychological warfare. Propaganda broadcasts, falsified reports of her defeat, and subtle disinformation campaigns aimed to undermine local allegiance and erode confidence in her interventions. Eve countered these with her typical subtlety, exploiting gaps in communication, amplifying misperceptions of Imperial competence, and nudging influential coalition leaders toward decisions that reinforced stability and cooperation. The Imperials' efforts backfired spectacularly, as local factions increasingly perceived Eve not as a threat, but as a stabilizing force capable of guiding multiple warring interests toward harmony without coercion. Tensions reached a boiling point when Sarisval, frustrated by repeated failures, devised a plan to draw Eve into a direct confrontation. He captured a settlement that she had protected, threatening the population to lure her out. Eve responded with calm precision. Rather than attacking immediately, she calculated every variable: the number of civilians, the structural weaknesses of Imperial fortifications, and the potential reactions of surrounding factions. When she finally appeared, she did so not as a destroyer, but as an undeniable presence of consequence. By subtly amplifying errors in the Imperial forces' strategy, she forced Sarisval into retreat while ensuring the safety of civilians. Her demonstration left the Imperials demoralized, their confidence shattered by an adversary who exercised power without passion, rage, or visible aggression. Throughout these events, Eve's dark side mastery deepened. She refined her techniques for manipulating probability, now able to orchestrate outcomes across multiple layers of conflict simultaneously. Local factions began to emulate aspects of her method, applying her philosophy to internal disputes and planetary governance. Even those skeptical of her alignment recognized the effectiveness of her approach: stability achieved not through fear or subjugation, but through calculated influence. By the end of this campaign, the Imperials had withdrawn from the Midrim cluster, realizing that engagement with Eve was both futile and strategically unwise. Her influence had far-reaching consequences. Coalition leaders, who had once relied on raw aggression or dogma, began adopting new strategies, blending traditional force understanding with Eve's probability-guided philosophy. Former Sith and Jedi remnants began negotiating under conditions of subtle consequence rather than brute power, fostering alliances and resolving disputes that had persisted for decades. The Midrim was transformed into a zone of unprecedented stability, achieved not through domination, but through mastery of subtle, controlled influence. By the conclusion of these events, Eve had not only neutralized the immediate Imperial threat, but had fundamentally altered the operational and philosophical landscape of the Midrim. Her approach challenged the assumptions of the galaxy's power structures. Raw strength and fear were no longer the only currencies of authority. Instead, deliberate application of consequence, guided by mastery of the dark side, offered a new paradigm for control, stability, and influence. Eve's actions left a lasting mark on the galaxy, her presence both a warning and a lesson, shaping the behavior of all who would dare oppose or emulate her. The repercussions of Eve's campaign rippled far beyond the Midrim, drawing the attention of both ancient Sith remnants and covert Republic sympathizers. Reports of an operative manipulating outcomes with uncanny precision reached Coruscant, echoing through the corridors of power. The Republic, though fractured and wary, debated the implications. An individual wielding influence without allegiance could destabilize entire sectors if left unchecked. Jedi Masters argued for observation and potential engagement, cautious of her dark side alignment, yet intrigued by the strategic genius she displayed. Eve, however, did not concern herself with bureaucratic debate. She moved methodically, aware that every action and reaction in this galaxy carried consequences not immediately visible, but detectable to one who understood probabilities and the currents of the dark side. Her next challenge emerged from the remnants of a Sith cult operating in the Outer Rim. Unlike conventional Imperial forces, these zealots were attuned to ancient rituals and had spent decades refining methods to amplify the dark side through ritualistic focus on celestial alignments and force-imbued artifacts. They detected Eve's presence almost instinctively, their rituals responding to the unique distortion she projected. These Sith loyalists did not understand her philosophy, nor her approach to consequence-guided influence. To them, power demanded submission, dominance, and fear. Her philosophy of subtle consequence threatened the very foundation of their dogma, and they resolved to confront her directly. Eve approached the Outer Rim system cautiously. Sensors picked up the cult's fortifications, arrayed around a volcanic planet whose surface was scarred with ancient Sith runes. Lava flows pulsed with an unnatural crimson glow, reflecting the ambient energy of the dark side. Eve did not underestimate them. Instead, she observed, calculating the optimal convergence of timing, environmental manipulation, and psychological influence. Her strategy was surgical, designed to minimize casualties while asserting dominance over those who misunderstood her power. As she descended into the atmosphere, the volcanic winds buffeted her form, her dark side aura adapting to the fluctuating energy signatures of the planet. The initial engagement was a clash of philosophy more than physical might. The cultists unleashed waves of force-fueled attacks, twisting the environment into chaotic maelstrom of energy and debris. Lava geysers erupted unpredictably, their paths manipulated by the cult's command over the dark side. Eve moved with uncanny precision, sidestepping eruptions and redirecting force blasts with minimal exertion. She struck with controlled bursts of kinetic energy, not to destroy, but to disrupt. Each movement demonstrated her mastery, an equilibrium of aggression, control, and consequence. The cultists were unprepared for such an approach, their rigid adherence to fear-based control undermining their tactical flexibility. Within hours, Eve had neutralized the cult's leadership. She did not execute them. Rather, she imposed a psychological restraint through calculated presence, instilling clarity and doubt simultaneously. The surviving members re-evaluated their allegiance and methodology, many retreating to rebuild under new paradigms influenced indirectly by her actions. Eve's dark side philosophy had demonstrated superiority not through raw power, but through adaptability, precision, and the ability to orchestrate events without unnecessary devastation. Simultaneously, political factions in neighboring systems observed these developments. Some sought her guidance, attempting to emulate her methods in governance and conflict resolution, while others feared her growing reputation and sought alliances to counterbalance her influence. Eve remained methodical, recognizing that the balance of power was as fragile as it was dynamic. Every new faction introduced variables, each with ambitions and miscalculations. She manipulated outcomes with subtlety, maintaining dominance without inciting open hostility, an exercise in strategy that tested her mastery of both dark side energies and probabilistic outcomes. Complications arose when a coalition of neutral traders, smugglers, and mercenaries perceived Eve as a potential threat to their autonomy. These independent actors, unbound by allegiance to Republic or Sith, moved unpredictably, their actions shaped by profit, reputation, and survival. Eve engaged them using a combination of presence and influence. Subtle manipulations guided their decision-making, creating scenarios where conflict became unnecessary, yet cooperation remained advantageous. The result was an intricate web of alliances and deterrence, each actor contributing to a larger system influenced by her unseen hand. However, not all outcomes were favorable. One faction misinterpreted her intervention as manipulation intended to dominate or coerce. Skirmishes broke out in isolated pockets, blaster fire echoing across orbital platforms and planetary surfaces. Eve responded with precision, neutralizing threats with minimal harm. Her actions emphasized control rather than destruction, maintaining credibility while asserting authority. Through these encounters, she reinforced her central philosophy. Influence is power, but indiscriminate force undermines legitimacy. Even adversaries who survived her interventions began to respect her competence and restraint. The most significant confrontation in this sequence involved a former Republic intelligence operative who sought to exploit Eve's growing network for personal gain. This individual attempted to manipulate local factions into a trap, hoping to either coerce allegiance or undermine her credibility. Eve anticipated the maneuver, employing a multi-layered response. She guided events to reveal the operative's deception without compromising local stability, using psychological and environmental manipulation in tandem. By the time the operative realized the failure, Eve had already re-established equilibrium, demonstrating the futility of underestimating her strategic foresight. Through these events, Eve's reputation as a calculated, morally complex force spread. She became known not only for her mastery of the dark side, but for her ability to navigate the galaxy's political and tactical landscapes without resorting to overt brutality. Her presence challenged conventional definitions of power, authority, and morality. Jedi and Sith alike began re-examining the limitations of traditional dark side and light side approaches, forced to acknowledge that influence, probability manipulation, and strategic foresight could rival or surpass conventional force power in efficacy. As the systems in the Outer Rim stabilized, Eve paused to assess the long-term impact of her actions. Her philosophical imprint was evident. Factions that once acted impulsively or aggressively now moved with increased caution and consideration. Decisions were no longer dictated solely by fear, ambition, or ideology, but by the calculated anticipation of outcomes and consequences, an intellectual dark side approach that had redefined power dynamics. Yet, even as she consolidated influence, she remained vigilant. The galaxy was vast, and anomalies, whether Imperial, Sith, or otherwise, persisted beyond her immediate perception. Her strategy required patience, observation, and continuous adaptation. By the end of this, Eve had achieved a level of mastery and influence unprecedented in the Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era. She had demonstrated that power could be exercised responsibly, yet unflinchingly, even when the means involved the morally ambiguous path of the dark side. Her interactions reshaped not only immediate conflict zones, but the underlying philosophies of multiple factions, from the remnants of the Sith to neutral independent operators. Every system touched by her intervention carried the imprint of her strategy, a silent testament to the potential of calculated, conscious manipulation of outcomes. The culmination of Eve's post-Hexenbiest campaign approached as intelligence reports converged on a singular ominous target, a hidden Sith enclave on the shadowed world of Moraband. Unlike the Outer Rim cults, these Sith were not disorganized zealots. They were descendants of ancient lines, attuned to the Force in ways few in the galaxy could comprehend. Rumors described their master, a figure whose knowledge of the dark side rivaled the oldest Sith holocrons. They had sensed Eve's approach long before she arrived, feeling the subtle currents of her influence ripple across the galaxy. Where she sought balance through strategic consequence, they sought dominance through fear, ritual, and annihilation. A confrontation was inevitable. Eve's journey to Moraband was calculated. She traversed hyperspace lanes known only to those who dared the Outer Rim's unstable sectors, her ship moving with deliberate precision. Along the way, she monitored communications, analyzed energy signatures, and anticipated the movement of mercenaries, spies, and Sith informants who might attempt interception. Every calculation was designed to ensure she arrived prepared yet unencumbered by unnecessary engagements. The dark side within her pulsed in harmony with her intent, its energy tempered by intellect rather than rage. She understood that overexertion or miscalculation could be fatal in a domain saturated with ancient Sith power. Upon reaching Moraband, Eve observed the planet from orbit. The surface was a jagged landscape of black stone spires, obsidian plateaus, and cratered valleys, all bathed in a dim red glow from the planet's weak sun filtered through thick, churning clouds. Ancient Sith temples dotted the terrain, their spires and jagged rooftops resonating with the concentrated dark side. The atmosphere itself seemed to vibrate with latent power. Eve allowed herself a moment to absorb the data. Wind patterns influenced by force amplification, tectonic instability heightened by centuries of ritualistic energy, and pockets of intense magnetic fluctuation. Each detail could be leveraged strategically or serve as a potential hazard. She descended to the surface, stepping onto jagged obsidian as her presence radiated outward. Immediately, the air responded. Whispers without sound teased at her perception, the remnants of rituals designed to confuse and dominate intruders. Eve maintained focus, reinforcing her mind with layers of awareness and consequence projection. The first Sith acolytes approached, masked, cloaked, and radiating lethal intent. They unleashed blasts of raw dark side energy, twisting the terrain, summoning whips of force-infused flame, and attempting to overwhelm her with pure intimidation. Eve moved with precise control. She did not react impulsively. She anticipated each assault, exploiting their rigid assumptions. A swing of energy redirected, a calculated diversion, a subtle manipulation of environmental instability. Each action neutralized their offensive without unnecessary destruction. The acolytes faltered, confused by the way she seemed to move between aggression and restraint with equal command. Their master had underestimated the integration of intellect and dark side mastery. Here was a practitioner who wielded consequences and tactical awareness as efficiently as they wielded raw power. The battle escalated as Eve confronted the Enclave's master. The Sith Lord emerged from the shadows, tall and imposing, eyes glowing red with millennia of accumulated dark side knowledge. Their presence was oppressive, a gravity well of hatred, ambition, and ancient memory. Energy crackled in the air as the two forces met, each aware that conventional tactics would be insufficient. Eve's mind worked rapidly, calculating probabilities of attacks, environmental interactions, and the psychological components of intimidation and manipulation. The Sith Master relied on overwhelming the opponent through power projection, attempting to dominate her perception with raw dark side waves. Eve responded with a combination of strategy and presence. She did not seek to overpower in brute strength. Instead, she manipulated the battlefield subtly. Rocks levitated in precise patterns, magnetic fields twisted to disorient, and the natural instability of Moraband's surface was used to channel energy flows toward her advantage. She met attacks with countermeasures designed to disrupt rhythm and focus, forcing her opponent to constantly recalibrate. With each exchange, she tested the limits of the master's reliance on fear, precision, and tradition. As their confrontation reached its zenith, the Sith Master attempted a concentrated dark side assault, one designed to obliterate mind, body, and environment simultaneously. Eve anticipated the trajectory of the attack, channeling her understanding of consequence and probability. Instead of deflecting or resisting directly, she guided the energy into destabilizing formations around the Master, creating feedback loops that amplified errors in his execution. Lava fissures opened, debris shifted, and the very surface of Moraband responded as an unwitting ally. The Sith Master faltered, exposed to the consequences of hubris and rigid philosophy. Seizing the moment, Eve extended her presence, not to destroy, but to enforce psychological clarity. She communicated an undeniable understanding of consequence. Your vision is limited. Control without consequence is chaos. Submission without choice is weakness. The words, imbued with the weight of the dark side and her mastery of strategic influence, struck deeper than any lightsaber or energy attack. The Sith Master reeled, forced to acknowledge that Eve represented a new paradigm of dark side application, one not dependent on domination, but on foresight, influence, and moral complexity. The battle concluded with the Master incapacitated but alive, forced into reflection rather than annihilation. Eve established control over the Enclave, reorganizing its structure to reflect her philosophy. The Acolytes, initially resistant, accepted guidance after witnessing the precision and efficacy of her approach. Moraband, a planet historically dominated by fear and ritualistic brutality, now bore the imprint of an intelligent dark side strategist, one who integrated intellect, consequence, and restraint into power. Across the galaxy, this decisive confrontation shifted perceptions. Republic intelligence, previously cautious and tentative, recognized Eve as a force not easily predicted or contained. Sith remnants debated her methods, some in awe, others in fear, realizing that conventional approaches to power and loyalty would no longer suffice. Independent factions, smugglers, and mercenary networks began to incorporate strategies inspired by her approach. Even Jedi scholars took note, cataloging her actions as a rare example of dark side mastery integrated with tactical acumen and philosophical sophistication. Eve, meanwhile, continued her observation of the galaxy. She understood that dominance was not merely a matter of physical or force-based power, but of understanding the threads connecting action and consequence across systems, species, and ideologies. The Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era had brought chaos, but also opportunity. Eve moved not as a conqueror in the traditional sense, but as an architect of influence, demonstrating that a being fully embracing the dark side could achieve unparalleled strategic impact without unnecessary destruction. Her journey had reached a pivotal apex, yet the galaxy remained vast, unpredictable, and full of variables yet unseen. The lesson of Moraband solidified her role. In a galaxy where power was often measured by fear, weapons, or allegiance, there existed an alternative, a dark side path defined by understanding, precision, and the careful orchestration of consequence. The culmination of her post-Hexenbiest transformation had not merely altered factions or battles. It had shifted the philosophical foundations of power, leaving an indelible mark on every system that had observed or felt her presence. The galaxy had changed. Eve's presence reverberated across star systems, altering calculations, alliances, and the perception of the dark side itself. Reports of her activities, disabling fleets without destruction, reorganizing Sith enclaves through intellect and influence, negotiating outcomes that left her adversaries alive yet humbled, spread quickly through the Outer Rim and into the core worlds. Her arrival had forced a re-evaluation of traditional power structures. The Jedi Council debated whether she represented a threat to be contained or a dark side philosophy to study, while the remnants of the Sith struggled to reconcile her approach with millennia of rigid dogma. Even the independent factions and criminal syndicates, who had long thrived in the shadows of galactic turmoil, took notice, sending envoys to gauge her intent and potential utility. Eve herself had taken Moraband as a base of operations, not as a fortress of tyranny, but as a center of strategic observation. She stood atop one of the jagged spires at twilight, watching the red-stained horizon. The wind howled around her, carrying scents of sulfur, ozone, and the residual energies of countless dark side rituals. Her perception extended across the planet, scanning for disturbances in both the Force and conventional signals. Where most would see a barren, hostile world, Eve saw a canvas of potential, a place where influence, consequence, and calculated intervention could reshape the balance of power. Her thoughts turned to the decisions she had made during her post-Hexenbiest transformation. Embracing the dark side had not been a simple surrender to emotion or power. It had been an acknowledgement of her own agency, a choice to wield her abilities with precision, intellect, and strategic intent. The galaxy had assumed that power corrupts, that dominance equates to destruction, but she had demonstrated an alternative. Mastery, not annihilation. Consequence, not chaos. The ancient Sith and scattered dark side users who had opposed her now faced the unsettling reality that the galaxy's paradigm of power could no longer remain static. Yet even as her influence spread, Eve understood that her path was not without risk. Imperial remnants continued to monitor her activities, dispatching reconnaissance vessels and covert operatives to probe her defenses. Jedi scouts, initially wary, observed her with a mixture of fascination and concern, unable to categorize her in the familiar dichotomy of light and dark. Mercenary bands and criminal syndicates sought alliances, some out of respect, others out of fear. Every faction she interacted with offered a potential advantage, yet also carried the threat of betrayal or misjudgment. She moved carefully, aware that even a single misstep could shift the delicate balance she had established. The culmination of her strategy emerged in a series of calculated interventions across contested systems. Eve orchestrated supply diversions, sabotaged oppressive governance without mass casualties, and dismantled rival criminal operations through psychological insight rather than brute force. Her reputation grew as a being who wielded power with surgical precision, leaving adversaries incapacitated, humiliated, or strategically neutralized. Tales of her interventions began to circulate even in the core worlds, where citizens and politicians debated the morality and implications of her methods. Some saw her as a necessary force for equilibrium, others as an unsettling harbinger of a new dark side doctrine. Among her greatest challenges was managing the philosophical tension her existence introduced. Jedi scholars debated her methodology in archives and temples, struggling to reconcile her effectiveness with her lack of allegiance to their teachings. Sith historians recorded her deeds with a mixture of awe and dread, recognizing that her approach bypassed centuries of doctrine. Independent factions, observing from the shadows, began to emulate her tactics selectively, incorporating elements of strategic restraint and consequence-driven decision-making into their own operations. Eve had become more than a warrior. She was a catalyst for systemic transformation across the galaxy. Her post-Hexenbiest transformation reached its philosophical apex when she encountered a coalition of disparate factions converging on a disputed system. The planet was rich in resources and held both strategic and symbolic value. Jedi, Sith, Imperial remnants, and neutral syndicates were poised for inevitable conflict. Rather than engage in direct combat, Eve intervened using her understanding of consequence and influence. Through precise manipulations, she guided rival forces into positions where engagement became mutually disadvantageous. Communications were subtly disrupted, resource allocations were rebalanced, and the planet's natural hazards were exploited to enforce tactical equilibrium. When the dust settled, the factions withdrew, wary and confused, leaving the planet intact. Casualties were minimal, yet every group had been forced to acknowledge the presence of an external power operating beyond the usual metrics of the Force or technology. Jedi and Sith alike felt the ripple of her decisions through the Force, a presence not aligned with light or dark, yet undeniably commanding attention and respect. Her actions demonstrated that the dark side could be applied not only as a tool of domination, but as a framework for calculated, systemic change. In her private moments, Eve reflected on the personal cost of her journey. The Post-Hexenbiest transformation had elevated her power and strategic capabilities, but it also carried the weight of isolation. She had severed conventional allegiances, walked a path neither Jedi nor Sith could fully comprehend, and embraced a philosophy that required constant vigilance, adaptability, and discipline. Her mastery of the dark side was complete in capability, but incomplete in companionship. She remained singular, an archetype rather than a member of any collective. Yet she understood that this solitude was a necessary condition for her vision. Influence untempered by conventional loyalties could reach where compromise could not. Eve's final act in this saga was to establish a network of observation and influence. Across the galaxy, hidden nodes transmitted data, monitored faction movements, and predicted potential conflicts. Her philosophy of consequence and calculated intervention became embedded in the infrastructure of these networks, allowing her presence to extend subtly beyond direct engagement. She was no longer merely a practitioner of the dark side. She had become a systemic agent, capable of shaping outcomes and enforcing equilibrium across multiple sectors without direct confrontation. The Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era concluded with a galaxy subtly but irrevocably altered. Factions recalibrated their strategies, independent systems reconsidered their allegiances, and the philosophical understanding of the dark side expanded to accommodate Eve's influence. No longer a mere operative or rogue agent, she had ascended to the level of a paradigm shifter, an entity whose decisions, methods, and philosophy would echo for generations. Morality, power, and consequence had intertwined into a new doctrine, one where intellect, strategy, and the dark side coalesced into a single, undeniable force. As Eve gazed at the distant stars from Moraband's highest spire, she recognized the scale of her impact. She had reshaped the galaxy without the wholesale destruction that had defined previous eras of dark side dominance. Her influence extended not merely through fear or coercion, but through careful orchestration of consequence, ensuring that every action produced meaningful, predictable outcomes. The galaxy would never forget the arrival of a being who fully embraced the dark side, yet wielded it with unprecedented intelligence and moral sophistication. And though her work was far from complete, the foundation had been laid. Jedi, Sith, Imperial remnants, and independent factions now operated under the implicit understanding that power had evolved beyond conventional binaries. Eve's legacy, her philosophy, her tactics, her relentless embrace of consequence, would continue to challenge, inspire, and intimidate all who encountered it. The Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era was not merely a chapter in her story. It was a watershed moment for the galaxy itself. Her gaze swept across the horizon one final time, the winds carrying whispers of the past, present, and future, all converging on a single truth. The galaxy would never be the same. Eve had become more than a wielder of the dark side. She had become a living embodiment of strategic consequence, an agent of profound change whose presence would be felt across systems, starships, and philosophies for decades to come. The galaxy would remember. Eve's journey through the Post-Hexenbiest Transformation Era had redefined the parameters of power, morality, and influence in the Star Wars galaxy. By fully embracing the dark side, she demonstrated that strength need not equate to destruction, and that mastery of consequence could rival conventional dominance. Her interventions reshaped factions, neutralized conflicts, and challenged the rigid doctrines of Jedi, Sith, and independent actors alike. While she operated alone, her philosophy became a paradigm, influencing decisions and strategies across countless systems. The galaxy had been irrevocably altered by her presence, and the legacy of her calculated, disciplined dark side mastery would echo through generations. In a universe defined by struggle between light and dark, Eve carved a new path, one that was neither fully aligned nor entirely rebellious, but undeniably transformative. Her story had reached a decisive climax, yet the consequences of her choices would continue to ripple, shaping the galaxy's future in ways only she could foresee.